Welcome to the wonderful world of wine, exploring all things wine with you. We are your hosts, Mark Lindsay and Kim Simone, and you can find us on Facebook at The Wonderful World of Wine. Hello, listeners, and welcome to the wonderful world of wine. Every couple of weeks, Mark and I meet with you and discuss trending topics in the wine world, anything and everything that you might want to know about wine. And we love to bring this show to you either on Franklin Public Radio or through our podcast. And how are you today, Mark?
Everything is great, Kim. Excited. I think we have some interesting topics today to discuss. And,
yeah, we got some fun and different things to do.
Involve some experimenting. So
That's right.
We like that.
As our longtime listeners know, we like to sort of keep our finger on the pulse of where wine is popping up in popular culture. And there was a bit from the last season of, was it Succession, Mark?
Yes.
Where they talk about this thing called hyperdecanting, which seems to involve putting your wine in a blender in order to aerate it in the same way that you would do by putting it in decanter and letting it get some air for a few hours. And Mark always seems to have a sixth sense for being able to come up with these things that are going on in pop culture for wine. So what was it about this one that sort of attracted your interest, Mark?
Well, I think first that it's a trend. And second, that there was a positive article and there was a negative article, like everything else in the wine world. So I said, well, geez, Kim, have you done this? I've never done it. And it looked fun. So we did it. And it turns out we kind of did it different ways. But maybe we should just give the listeners a little background. Hyperdecanting. What is it about? What does it do? What's the benefits of doing it? It's all about aerating, Kim, which I think we spent an episode on, exposing the wine to some air so it gets rid of some maybe unwanted compounds that may evaporate and give it a little better aroma. We can accomplish this by just swirling our glass or putting it in a decanter or pouring it into a glass. And you know me with all my gadgets. I had aerators and decanters, and
I was going to bring up your aerating your gadgets for aerating wine that I have seen you use in classes and in tastings.
And I guess one of the things about these type of gadgets or doing this, it's called hyperdecanting. We miss out on the journey of what the wine would do by doing these kind of tricks to the wine, Kim? Is it not evolving properly? We're trying to rush the process of opening up the wine. I remember reading a lot of geeky technical stuff in the past about how wineries wouldn't use any mechanical pumps when they're moving wine within the winery because they felt that the pumps were actually damaging the wine, the structure of the wine. So I'm kind of wondering, is this not a good thing to do to the wine? Is it cheating in a way for the wine?
Well, I think in a lot of ways, there are pros and cons to lots of things. So I think it comes down to what is your point in wanting to decant a particular wine. So for some wines, they need that extra little bit of oxygen, not just for the aromas, but also for the texture of the wine. So sometimes you have a red that is so big and powerful that the tannins can kind of get in the way of the pleasure of the wine. And that for me is probably the main reason for decanting a wine. Maybe it's a little too young, maybe it's a little too harsh and needs to soften up a little bit. So that is why I would decant a wine that's on the younger side in order to soften it a little bit, to make it a little bit more of a pleasant experience, and then to release some of those aromatics. There's another reason why you would want to decant a wine if it happened to be an older bottle that had already thrown a lot of sediment. So sometimes you see with older red wines that some of their tannins have literally clumped together and then settled to the bottom of your wine glass, or hopefully not, or your wine bottle, and it kind of looks like coffee grinds on the bottom of your bottle there. If that's the case with your wine, then you want to decant it so that you get the clear wine and not the chewy, gunky stuff on the bottom. But that's not really what we're talking about here. So we're talking about opening up a wine by giving it some air, by giving it some oxygen, and really sort of moving quickly through the aging process. And I think this comes back to what you were just saying about, do we miss some of the pleasant steps along the way? So if we're talking about, well, the point of doing this is to get from point A to point C without having to go through point B, then I think that this is something that could and should maybe be looked at. But if it's a wine that doesn't really necessarily need the decanting in order to really taste like a better wine in the right here and now, then I agree with you. You sort of miss those subtle changes that might happen in your glass over the course of an hour or two of working through that bottle.
You said it perfect, though. It speeds up that waiting for the aging process to happen. It's a way, they say, to speed that up. And the article that brought it to our attention, it said, here's why you want to put your wine in a blender, which is hyperdecanting. But it had an interesting background to it, Kim. I never knew that the process was created by Nathan Myhrvold. Is that how you say his name? Myhrvold?
I'm not sure.
He was an author who did an article in Modern Cuisine back in 2013.
Yeah, I did not know this either.
He noted that less than 1 minute in the blender with your wine equals 1 hour of decanting in time. And I think in the past, we also had some other gadgets we saw that you could set things where it was like a hot plate type of, not a hot plate, but a stirrer.
Yeah,
like
it was like a little motorized
stirrer,
thing.
Right?
Yeah.
So, and you'd put it on, you'd set how long you want to age it for by stirring it. So like you said, this process supposedly softens the tannins, makes it a little smoother flavor, and they recommend putting wine in till it froths up and then let it rest to do it. So we said, let's do it. What did you first pick for a wine, Kim?
Okay, so I had a very nice Australian Shiraz that I decided to use for my wine. I didn't want anything that was too subtle, that I maybe wouldn't be able to pick out the differences if there wasn't much of a difference between my blended wine and I can't even use the word blended, right? Because that's something else in the wine world. My hyper decanted wine and my unhyper decanted wine. So I have this big, bold Aussie Shiraz that is full of a lot of fruit and spice character, but not really hard tannins. So the tannins themselves are already a little bit softer, but I was hoping that I would be able to notice a difference just in the process between the kind of the before and the after.
And what was the vintage?
I think it was a 2020, so it's fairly
young.
New.
Okay,
it's fairly young.
Yeah.
And I used a stick blender because I felt that would be less messy than using my blender. And both of these articles that we read kind of talked about doing them both ways, either putting it in a full glass canister blender or using a stick blender. And one of the reasons they said to use a stick blender is because your regular blender might still have residual smells or flavors from other things you've made in there, be it a smoothie or, a soup, or like I make mayonnaise in mine. So I really didn't want mayonnaise-y wine. So I used a stick blender and I tasted the wine before I put it in. And then I poured myself a control sample in a glass and then zhuzhed it up with my stick blender, let the foam settle, and then poured that sample into the same type of glass, same amount. And I labeled the glasses as to which was which. I smelled them, I tasted them, and then I covered up the labels and let them sit for an hour. So I'm going to go back and retaste and see if I can notice difference between the two.
And this was the other difference between Kim and I. Kim and I is doing this live, and I did my homework last night. So it's interesting to get the take this way. And Kim used a stick blender. I used a regular blender, and Kim's wine was actually newer. So this is good because we have different takes on how it was done and the wine.
What were your impressions of yours?
Well, I used the 2017 Norello Mascalese from Sicily because I buy this wine by the case. And when I drink it, it tends to be very acidic and very earthy until it opens up. So I said, geez, I'd like to try this and speed up this decanting process with the blender. So
that was smart to go with a wine that you have some history with. So it's something that you've consumed on multiple occasions and that you know.
Yeah. And I wanted to see if it would change the normal way I'm used to. And I did like you. I first poured in a glass, but then for my second pour, I poured half into a decanter and I poured the other half into the blender. So I had actually 3 kind of references. and I just put it in the blender until I hit it basically low until it frothed up. And it did you notice, Kim, it froths up
I definitely got some serious frothiness on mine.
major.
Yes.
And not only that, but once you pour it out of the blender, it stays pretty bubbly, frothy, doesn't it, for a while?
It did kind of change color for a bit. And I think it went from being, I don't want to say that I had a clear wine because I have actually a very dark wine, but it did sort of change my perception of the pigments in the wine for a little bit.
Yeah.
But not after an hour of sitting on my counter. And my husband moved the glasses around so I wouldn't have any idea of which one I was tasting. And I took my glasses off. So I'm completely blind here.
So we did the same thing, 3 things. But so tell me, what are you noticing?
So when I first tasted them, knowing which was which, I felt that the hyperdecanted wine had a little bit more of a muted nose. Like I couldn't quite smell as much of it as the original wine. It wasn't quite as vibrant. It wasn't quite as fruity. But now that I go back and forth between these two, not knowing which is which, I am really having a hard time finding any differences between the two of them.
That's very interesting because that's exactly what I noted on the hyperdecanted wine. It seemed less aromatic. I was in the glass, I was getting aromatics, the same acidity, earthy finish. The decanter had the same aromatics. The acidity was a little softer and the finish was a little cleaner because it obviously opened it up pouring into the decanter. But the blended, just like you, I lost some of the fruity aromatics and I got a little bit more of the spice. So it kind of brought out a different aromatic, but lost its fruity aromatics. So kind of similar to what you're saying, I think.
Yeah. So I have I would say one of mine smells just a tad fruitier and the other one smells just a little bit spicier. So that'll be interesting to see which is which when I finally reveal them. But flavor wise, I'm not really noticing any differences between my two.
Really? That's interesting. So with mine, I noticed significant on the palate, especially like mid palate, much softer.
I'm not, but I have soft tannins to begin with in mine. And mine is still, both glasses are still very bright. So I think because I have a softer red to begin with, there just might not have been that much change for me to notice. As opposed to your wine, which it sounds like you had significantly firmer tannins in yours than I have.
Yeah, and it kind of did soften it out a little bit, like if it was aged a few more years. So,
so you didn't do yours blind, right?
No. I knew.
Okay.
I knew.
I'm going all super scientific
here. Yeah. So it's good because we 2 different experiments.
Yeah.
I wanted to use like an inexpensive and see if it, made any difference. But, there's so many ways we could have went with this. So while you're kind of tasting that, let's talk a little bit about like anything else in the wine world. I said earlier, we saw this article, why you should do this. And then VinePair had an article said, no, you should not do this to your wine, right? I mean,
because they're so down to earth.
Just because it was in that HBO series. Doesn't mean...
VinePair is great because they're so no nonsense sometimes.
Well, someone always has to give that
Don't
other
do
side,
that.
right? It's someone has to give the other
right.
view.
Someone has to be the voice of reason. Thank you, VinePair.
And one point was don't stick high-end wines in your blender. What was
this kind of goes back to, wasn't there a thing about putting your wine in the microwave for a little while?
Right.
That was like a flash in the pan 6 days of people microwaving their wines.
It's all about the experience. If there's something you can do that makes it better for you or improve something, I have no problem with it. What's the price point of your wine, Kim?
About $25.
Yeah, mine was like a $20 bottle too, so I wouldn't consider them high end. So we didn't violate their.
No, but we're using, good quality wine. I think we would still probably call them fine wines still, right?
Right. They were talking about high end, but also you'd said earlier about decanting aged wines for sediment, that you wouldn't really want to do this process to a really fine aged wine.
Exactly.
Because it needs care and you could actually ruin it by aerating it too much, this process. So,
and I think that in general, you should generally be careful with your wines because there are those compounds that, and we hear this from winemakers all the time, that they're not handled gently, really from start to finish. that you can lose a lot of those nice aromatics, or you can lose some of that good structure that you're going for. So kind of think about it like, you don't want to bruise your tomatoes and you don't want to bruise your apples. So you don't necessarily want to bruise your wine too much either.
Right. And there was another article, Williamson Sonoma, that said, use the blender. A young red, they said 30 to 60 seconds in the blender. Our friend Madeline at Wine Folly also said she did this. And she made an interesting note saying that it makes the wine smell oddly vodka-like, removing its aromas. So
I can only imagine that it sort of makes the alcohol much more volatile.
Yeah.
So maybe that is coming out of the glass first and foremost, and it kind of hit her nose with this big hit of alcohol, and that was where that vodka-y sensation came from.
And she said it softened the tannins, but loses its unique character. Which going
kind
back,
of dumbs it down.
Yeah, going back to the wine I did. I mean, usually I have it with food, but I enjoy the wine when I'm just sipping it. It's not as easy to take because it's acidic, it's earthy. But I have to tell you, Kim, after doing the hyper decanting, I enjoyed it. And I don't know if it's just in my mind. Yeah, I did something to it. It's different now because I didn't do it blind like you. But in my mind, it made me feel like it was smoother. It was more or non-food wine. So what are you getting now on yours?
So I am sticking with one is slightly fruitier. One is slightly spicier. And when I revealed to myself which was which, that followed perfectly with how I perceived them right after I did the hyper decanting. So the one that was hyper decanted was a little less fruity and a little more spicy, and then vice versa for the one that I hadn't done anything with. So my intuition was right.
Yeah, nice.
I was right.
But it actually was exactly how I got the little bit more
exactly.
spice
And which
so,
as soon as you were saying that like one was fruitier and one was spicier, I'm like, oh my goodness, I had the same exact experience.
Yeah. So that's great.
Yeah, very cool.
And
I think next time you should do yours blind.
Yeah.
I am a big proponent of blind wine tastings these days.
We'll have to do
Sandy
them for
Block
each
would
other.
be very happy with me.
Yeah, we'll do them for each other so we don't know even what the wine is. And I think it'd be more fun. But, for our listeners, it's something to try. You have a blender or immersion blender like Kim. I think now that I think about it, my wife did say use the immersion, but probably didn't want me to put the wine in the blender.
Well, I was afraid of literally spewing wine all over my kitchen.
Yeah, it does. It does get frothy.
And get a mess.
It's interesting.
Yeah.
So,
well, thank you for such an interesting experiment for our show today for our listeners, Mark. This was fun, and I like these hands-on, interactive kind of things, and also enlightening. It's fun to read about something and then to actually get your hands dirty and do it as well.
Yeah, and if anybody tries it, please write Kim and I and let us know what happened in your experiment. We'd be curious to find out. You're listening to The Wonderful World of Wine, and we are your hosts, Kim and Mark, exploring all things wine with you. For more information about Kim, go to her website at commonwealthwineschool.com. If you'd like more information about myself, please go to franklinliquors.com. For past episodes, you can go to SoundCloud or iTunes. You can find us on Facebook at The Wonderful World of Wine, and you can find us on Twitter at Wine Education. Our program is supported by Franklin Public Radio. Next, we want to talk about vintage in wine, Kim. Does vintage matter? And let's just refresh our listeners, Kim. What is the definition of the vintage when it's on a wine?
So the vintage refers to during what year were those grapes picked? And it's a little bit less confusing to talk about vintage when you're talking about grape grown in the Northern Hemisphere, because our growing season up here lasts all throughout the same year. So like the baseball season is always going to be just in one year. Whereas if you're in the Southern Hemisphere, those grapes start to develop in one year, and then they'll finally be picked in another year. So there's this little crossover year. So more like the football season. So we like to refer to it as it's what year were those grapes picked in? So in the Southern Hemisphere, it will be in the spring. So, a couple of months after the turning of the year. Whereas in the Northern Hemisphere, it'll be in the fall. Did I just make it more confusing?
No. I just, for more clarification, Southern Hemisphere wines, their summer is now in 2023. So their wines are coming out. You're going to see 2023 Southern Hemisphere wines on the shelves very soon from say New Zealand.
Yep. So some of them are already in production. Some of the grapes are still on the vines, but it's mostly harvest season down in the Southern Hemisphere now.
In our area, it's just starting to bud. They'll be harvested at the end of this year. It's still going to be the 2023 vintage, but you probably won't see them until 2024 or further, right? Is that a simpler way? Okay. It is a little confusing, but the question really comes up, does vintage matter? And I wanted to ask you, Kim, when you do tastings at the school or put together, are you stressing the vintage on the sheets that you're handing out so everybody knows it's 2023 rosé, or it's do you stress the vintage as much today as you have in the past?
I don't think we stress it necessarily, although we do make a point of always letting people know what vintage of what wine are they tasting. And if, God forbid, we are showing a wine and we have one bottle of one vintage and another bottle of another vintage, we kind of freak out a bit because we want to make sure that we're showing everybody the same wine.
Right.
And there are some places in the world that make wine that the vintage really does matter to the taste of the wine. And we do see this from time to time, maybe not as frequently as, say, 20 years ago, but it still does matter for a lot of places that tend to be on kind of the limits of grape growing, or that have more variability in their weather throughout the year, or more variability in their climate. So we do talk about vintage a lot when it comes to Champagne or Bordeaux or some of those better places in the northern part of Italy, like the Piemonte. But for other places like New Zealand or California or Argentina, we really don't stress the vintage quite as much. There will still be slight variability between one vintage and the other, and the next, between, on the same exact wine from the same producer, same grapes, whatever, but not as impactful as in some other areas.
Yeah, because of climate change lately, I think we should pay a little bit more, because even these areas that are usually consistent with climate, it's changing. So there's some weird things happening all over the world where, one year everything's normal and then something freaky happens and they have a bad vintage or bad growing year. You wouldn't know that unless you looked at those so-called vintage charts that are out there, or you're following trends like we do and tell our listeners about when there's, these frosts or whatever.
Right.
So that's when it does matter, especially with the climate change. I think people should really pay attention to the vintage and trends in the wine to show what they know has been consistent is still not having any issues. And you mentioned New Zealand. I mean, the northern part of New Zealand just had horrible weather. So they're going to have a really bad vintage this year. So what do you think, Kim? You leaning more towards it does matter or doesn't matter when selecting wine?
I think it depends on the wine, just like anything else when we have these conversations where we say, does it matter? It's like, well, it depends. I think it depends on your price point, and I think it does depend on your region. So if you're drinking a $12 bottle of wine from Paso Robles in California, or, a $15 Malbec from Mendoza, does it really matter? I'm going to say not as much. But if you want to lay in a bottle of good champagne for your son's 21st birthday, like I just did, then yeah, vintage does matter. So, kind of like everything else, it depends on what you're going to do with that wine. It depends where you're going to consume that wine. What do you want to get out of that wine? If it's just, that you want to have a nice bottle to drink on Tuesday night with your pork chops, no, it really doesn't. There are some wines that you want as fresh as possible. So in that respect, the age of the wine matters, but not so much the particular vintage. It depends on where we are, right? If we're in 2023, so, you're probably not wanting a New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc that's any older than 2020. But if we were in 2030, you really don't want that bottle of 2020 New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc. So that's a slightly different conversation. That's talking more about age than about particular vintage. And I think what we're trying to talk about is like the particular year. Like, why does 1985 matter more than, say, 1989 if you're talking about aged wine?
And you hit all the points that they pretty much mentioned in the articles about doesn't matter. It depends on your taste, your budget, how you're drinking or enjoying the wine, even where you shop. Some people focus on that, having certain vintages of the wine. One of the things we're talking about doing an event and putting the vintage down. I always double check to make sure what I'm presenting or trying to sell matches up with the details I know of the wine. And people can always find out about their wine when we talk about the tech sheets. It should tell you, a good tech sheet, what happened during the vintage, during the harvest, how was the growing season, if it was a good vintage or not for the wine. They're going to tell you. We had a good growing season. It was a normal growing season, that type of thing. And I always like checking the tech sheets to make sure, especially if it's like you said, if it's a wine, your go-to wine, you want to make sure everything was produced, the same way that year. So tech sheets are a good guide.
But that is hard too, because sometimes vintages change so quickly on the shelf and we can see one side of it or the other. Like sometimes I'll be looking up the information for a bottle that I like literally have right in front of me, and the winery will either have the previous year's tech sheet up or the next vintage's tech sheet up. And I'm like, but
yeah,
this I'm looking for. Sometimes it can be very frustrating.
Right.
Those are the little weird things that we deal with in our line of work.
Yeah. But I'm glad you mentioned that, especially about the shelf. When you go into a store and you see those shelf talkers, lately I've seen a lot of people doing this. They'll say, 90-point vintages the last 3 years, 4 years. You don't know what that review is for. What vintage was it for? And like you said, it changes so fast.
Yep.
You could see a review of a wine from the 2020 vintage, but the one on the shelf is now the current 2021 vintage. It can be very confusing. So that's why we say it doesn't matter. It does matter if you're checking reviews and they reviewed a certain vintage wine. That's the note that's going to match that proper vintage. So that's one of my pet peeves. Like besides going to the site,
it is.
That's one of the things that can be confusing with vintages. And have you used a vintage chart lately, Kim?
Not really. I really feel like I used to use them, I wouldn't say religiously, but way more frequently than I do now. And I feel like for myself recently and for classes and for trying to choose the best wine for a certain situation, really the only time that it has come up that I have needed to really pay attention to a particular vintage was when we were doing comparisons between the same wine. So we were doing vertical tasting. So we were doing the same wine from the same producer, but over a number of different vintages. So like that was very interesting to do, but they were all Bordeaux. So they're from a region that can have such variability from season to season that you really can taste it in the wine. Besides that and Champagne, those are really the only two situations that I've really noticed that recently it has made a big, big difference in what I'm trying to show from a wine.
Yeah. And it's interesting because we had this conversation recently about the old guidebook.
Yeah.
Remember we used to use the books for finding popular wines.
You used to carry them around, right. Or, you have them in your back pocket.
That's exactly what's happened with me with the vintage chart. I used to have a chart from each major publication, right? Parker,
we used to have them up on the wall of the wine store, and we would take them down when we got the new ones out. And we would like literally put them up on the wine fridge so that people could check them out as soon as they came into the back area that had all the French and Spanish and Italian wine.
And when you'd use them to sell too, because if you had, like you said, if you had multiple vintages of a wine on your shelf and someone would say to you, which would you go to? And you knew, hey, the 2017 was a better vintage.
It was very, very important.
I even had the little pocket one that was in my wallet. And now I rip them out of the thing and I never look at them.
I used to keep mine right next to my Red Sox schedule.
See?
In my purse.
That's geeky. That's geeky.
That's how you know you're a good New Englander.
Yeah. Wow. But yeah, it's just another thing so it made me lead when I was thinking of the article and I saw the headline, does it matter? I'm thinking, to me, I guess lately I don't key on it as much because I'm not using the vintage chart, or when someone goes to present a wine to me to sell to me, I'm not saying, oh wow, it's the 2017. But it did.
So why do you
to the
think
smoke.
that is?
You
If
know,
you and I have
maybe
both sort of
because-
had the same experience, is this a climate change thing? Is it that vintages are much more similar than dissimilar these days?
I think myself, Kim, it's that we're keeping up with the trends much easier now with everything on the internet. You know, we know this area has fires or this area had a frost. So I when I see it now, I don't need the chart to know because I've read it.
So you think
I've
that it's
seen it.
just that you have the knowledge and don't have to look back on it, and not that the vintage doesn't matter. The vintage does matter.
Does matter, but I think not that I have the knowledge, but I've seen it or I've been exposed to.
Well, that means that you have the knowledge.
Yeah, well, I don't know, you know,
Right?
if I can retain it is another thing.
That's a different question.
Yeah, but that's exactly what I think is happening. You're more up to date on what's going on. Whereas years ago, you might not have heard of what's going on in Bordeaux or Champagne, or you didn't hear it. Now it's as soon as something happens. I mean, just today I saw something where there was a ant problem in Argentina, and they just had fires or something. So now you see it. So now the next time someone comes around with one, I'll say, geez, was it in this area I saw had, this problem? So
but I think you've really hit the nail on the head with one thing, in that we don't need those books anymore because we now all have a phone in our back pocket that we can just quickly say, how was the 2019 vintage in Margaux? That kind of a thing.
Right.
So we don't need those things that are up on the walls any longer.
Right.
Yeah.
Things change, but well, we had to let the listeners know again, vintage. I think now we're getting towards rosé season.
Yay.
I feel people, one thing they don't look at is vintage on rosé. It's the same rosé. I drink Whispering Angel. I had it last year. It was the same. But we have that point now where there's some leftover wines from the previous season. So it does matter.
I'm much more forgiving of that than other people. I know a lot of people want like as fresh as possible.
Fresh,
and if it has even any age on it, it's not good anymore. I am not that person. I don't mind a little bit of age on my rosé, but again, personal preference. So it's all about what works for you. What do you like? And what is going to make you happiest as far as the wine in your glass.
And keep in mind, it is one of the things that's required on the label, right? If it says it's that, it has to be that vintage. So for the wine label geeks out there.
That's right.
Vintage. So that was fun, Kim, talking about hyperdecanting and vintage.
That's right. Thank you for listening to us today on The Wonderful World of Wine. We have been your hosts, Kim Simone and Mark Lindsay. You can find our past episodes on SoundCloud and iTunes. And as always, leave us your questions and comments on our Facebook page, which is The Wonderful World of Wine. And thank you to the Franklin Public Radio for supporting this broadcast. Cheers.
Wine, wine, wine.